and enjoy the passion that we all felt during those glory days. But coming up next, I suppose we're talking about France in terms of football, but we'll be speaking to a terrorism expert next. I suppose we'll be talking about France in terms of the terrorist attacks and the European response to ISIS. Well, look, the threat of ISIS and what has happened in Paris, hundreds of people killed by terrorists over the weekend, has dominated all our headlines in newspapers, news bulletins, radio bulletins alike. And somebody who knows a thing or two about terrorism and countering terrorism is Noel Whelan. He joined us a couple of years back here on the programme to talk about what he does. He's out in Malta at the moment. Noel, you're welcome back to Late Lunch. Talk to us a little bit about, Noel, if you can, the Paris attacks and your assessment of how sophisticated they were.
Well, I just like to point out that the Paris attacks are just an escalation of what's been happening over the last couple of years in mainland Europe and around the world. But my assessment is we're going to see a lot more of these attacks coming across Europe and other Western democracies. And the reason why that is because if people keep talking about airstrike after airstrike after airstrike, it's not really effective, because if you can imagine that people are in an area who are like terrorist organisations like ISIS or ISIL, what happens if they're in a sensitive location? They know they're going to get bombed, so they'll keep moving around and regrouping and moving and regrouping. So you can keep hitting and striking all you want with high-tech missiles, but the problem is that this type of enemy has actually migrated into other Western cities around the world. And, you know, the more you bomb there, you're going to get a reaction externally. And that's my assessment of the threat. The threat is going to keep growing and moving and changing form all the time. But when you see soldiers and police and other people trying to combat terrorism in a kinetic form, they're missing the most important thing, that the war, the fight, the phenomenon that they're fighting against actually exists more online now. So you need to take control of cyberspace as well, not just use the kinetic responses you have at your disposal.
What do you mean by that, Noel, in terms of cyberspace? How do you counter terrorism online?
Well, what you need to think about, you know, if you have people hacking websites and sending information across the networks, various networks in cyberspace, you need people equally as clever and had good ingenuity to actually counter these, to see where they can actually move from and actually anticipate and deny them their objectives online. For example, when I started my training like 20 years ago, I remember them telling me that the first thing you need to do in countering problems is you have to think like them, your opposition. And in that, you have to basically be able to anticipate. For example, have an imagination. They said you need an imagination. All you need is an imagination. You can achieve anything. It's very important to understand that, because if you can't take direct action against somebody, they will come against you in different ways. The threat keeps migrating. And if you think about previous conflicts, the people keep saying war on terror, war on terror. What war on terror? When was a war declared against the state? The people who are attacking people are what we call non-state actors in an international perspective. So they're acting behind the backs of other people which are elected representatives. So you can't actually go in and start annihilating and targeting. You've got to think about this. You're being attacked by non-state actors attacking international recognized states. And I don't want to use the word ISIL, Islamic State, because they are not a state. They're an illegal entity. So I don't even get the gratitude of saying Islamic State. What you're dealing with is a phenomenon, a group of radicalized people. And they will migrate. They have migrated. And you've seen attacks in Australia. You've seen attacks in the US. You've got stabbings. You've got all. And what's happening is that they're controlling the hearts and minds of people through the use of media, propaganda, YouTube, all these factors. They are dominating that space, and you must take the conflict to them and combat them within that space, not just by sending rockets in and blowing up places in Syria and the Middle East.
So are you talking, I suppose, about propaganda and wartime propaganda? We've seen it used in terms of World War I and World War II, but how could it be different this time, Noel?
Well, in World War II and World War I, you basically posters, people use illustrations to dehumanize an enemy. I mean, they don't have to do that here, because ISIS and these ISIL crowd are actually doing it for themselves. I mean, what we can't lose sight of here is that this is a war of Islamic extremism, okay? But more Muslim people are actually dying in this conflict themselves, because they're seen as legitimate targets because they're in the way, or they're coexisting in different ways with Western democracies. And this is what we're starting to see, and people really need to sit up and pay attention to this. You will not solve the problems The propaganda has to be beaten. It has to be the use of giving information to people, real-time information, not control of, how many photographs of this bombing or that bombing looks great, looks sexy, looks exclusive. We control and dominate the airwaves. We've got to look at this in a realistic way. I would like to be an idealist, but I have to be a realist. The important thing is this. When you see stuff on YouTube, Facebook, how much has Facebook changed in the last couple of years as a social media? Every bombing, you've got the Pakistan Air Force, you've got this force blowing up, showing target strikes. Behind every one of those strikes is a human. There's a human condition. So what I'm saying is when people are blowing up France, they're blowing up and walking into streets in Paris and basically doing dreadful, massacring people like this, it's because they can. Because people, can access the internet in a few minutes. It's free. It's accessible. How can you keep on top of that so the continuing conflict will go on in cyberspace as not in just the zone of the conflict in fighting, hand-to-hand, fighting. The only way you can win, and there's no even win in this situation, to reach the status quo, is that because you are fighting not one army like in World War I, World War II, or one nation or a couple of nations. You're fighting thousands of individuals who want to emulate and justify and actually carry out attacks. Basically, in essence, I could call this the war of the flea.
So how do you tackle it, though, in terms, how do you get to grips with this? It's guerrilla warfare. You don't know when people are going to strike. You don't know where people are getting these weapons and explosives from. So what do we do?
You have to have control. The question, the question was asked earlier on, okay, some explosives didn't go off in France. That's not really the issue. It's terrible, yes, but if you can't control the weapons on your streets and people can get access to weapons and machine guns and assault rifles and weapons of this and component parts to make explosives and stuff like this, if you can't control this, how can you control the safety of the people? What's really important is it's an evaluation, because terrorism thrives on liberal democracy. People are free to speak, but not necessarily are free to act when you break the law. The problem is by the time you've responded, people have already committed the crimes because they're talking about it. However, that in itself is a deliberate action on behalf of terrorist groups, because they know in certain countries they're free to speak and justify and enthuse people to carry out these types of attacks. So what this really would in time probably require is a reinterpretation of human rights, because at what point, where does the human rights of the victims of these types of attacks? So we have to look at this. We have to look at liberal democracy. And you can be guaranteed, when you look at the tactics and the strategies of Al-Qaeda and all these organizations over the last so many years, you know for a fact they know that in Western democracies protect this kind of activity because you are free. You are free to speak, free to act. And that's not me saying that you should curb civil liberties, because these people know quite well that when the government clamps down on people's civil liberties in order to protect against freedom of movement of terrorists, it's going to impinge on the civil liberties of the citizenry of states, and people will react against that government. And that's a deliberate tactic and technique and strategy of these organisations.
No, just before we go, we're squeezed for time, but what's your assessment of the threat to Ireland? Because a lot of people seem to think, due to our neutrality, I suppose our location, that perhaps we may be less of a threat than other European countries. What's your assessment of that?
You've got to remember that even being Irish and coming from my home as Ireland, because we've had people landing aircraft from different countries in our airspace and landing in different places, they will legitimately see people as an arm of the state or an arm of the militancy, so they will see Ireland as a legitimate target. Unfortunately, this is happening right across the world. However, we've got to remember that people are not attacked for their nation, they're attacked for what they represent. And that's really important, to look beyond the goldfish bowl of living in an island nation. We have to look beyond, we are victims. In Tunisia, when they start attacking the people, they didn't isolate, are you this, show me your passport. It's for what you represent. That's the way this phenomenon is changing. When we declare war on the terrorism, you cannot, because terrorism is a phenomenon. That's what it is. There's no unilateral state actor we can attack in response. That's really important. So Ireland, the fact that it contributes and is a partner of NATO and a part of other countries, sadly, what will happen is people will interpret that as a legitimate target, as they will do with other countries.
Okay, Noel, I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you very much for your contribution today. I'm sure we'll be talking to you again in the future. Unfortunately, this topic is going to dominate. Noel Whelan there, a counter and anti-terrorism expert, now based in Malta. We go now to news headlines at 2. Yes, you're listening to The Late Lunch on LMFM, and I believe across the northeast it's fairly rainy and pretty miserable out there. So